Well, thank you, everybody, for welcoming me here to a fellow land-grant campus, which University of Vermont is also, but quite a venerable one here. So I feel very pleased to be on your campus and delighted to be offering this lecture. So putting these two topics together, environment and Buddhism, is not your typical kind of combination, but I hope you'll take from this talk some insights either from Buddhism or from ways to think about some of these environmental challenges. So this is more of a reflective talk, you might say, and I won't have all the answers by any means. But let me first do a traditional Buddhist thing, which is to offer gratitude to the people whose shoulders I stand on. I would not be here with you today without those who guided some of my own personal Buddhist practice and my environmental thinking. So it's just kind of a tradition, both I would say in the environmental lineage, but particularly Buddhist lineage. So without naming all of them, just to know I'm kind of carrying them with me. And these ideas are partially my own and very much influenced by them. So let me begin by just laying out some of what I'm calling our common challenge. I'm certainly not the only person who's brought all these different topics to people's attention, but I wanted to use it as our foundation before we try to think what can Buddhism offer to this. So the challenge is not small. We know that there's quite a call for public dialogue around all these environmental issues. And this talk is particularly about what can the role of religious traditions be. How can religious and faith-based traditions, whether academic or in practice, raise shared public concerns of value? So we know there's issues to think about in climate, in population, in disasters around the world, politics. Many things have been highlighted by activists such as Occupy Wall Street. Today I'm feeling a little frustrated with Congress, as some of you might be. And certainly all the time we're talking about all this and trying to figure it out in our very human way, carbon emissions continue to rise. So most environmental scientists and practitioners and people in the field agree environmental systems are under siege and they are definitely failing in different places. On top of that, we have enormous rates of consumption around the world, only getting higher as more and more countries reach up into the middle class and higher levels of consumption, and that generates a tremendous amount of waste. So right here, of course, in the US, 75% of the Earth's biocapacity is heavily used by us, but also China, India, Europe, and Japan. The big industrial nations, the big consuming nations, and our own population responsible for 25% of the Earth's resources, even though we're just a little 5% of the population. But the take-home point is more that people everywhere struggle with these moral dilemmas of waste and consumption at whatever level they're on. It's a struggle. There are many moral questions in it, whether it's about food or stuff or the generation of it or energy. So that's the common challenge, the struggle. Now, different views of nature make it even more complicated. Nobody can agree, really, whether it's from a cultural perspective or a religious perspective, what view of nature should dominate, and so usually they clash. So you might be thinking nature is a resource for human use. Those trees grow well, let's cut them down to make a house, and let's harvest the food we grow. That's a definite resource use, very utilitarian. But what if you also see it as your spiritual home? What if one group of people sees one place in nature as a spiritual home and the others see that place as a resource use? They're going to clash. Or you might see nature as protecting humans from some of the challenges coming through the ecosystem. We talk now, this is a new phrase, ecosystem functions. So wetlands, oh, they're really good because they'll protect us from sea level rise if we've got nature serving as ecosystem functions. Or maybe it's a legacy through evolution. But if you disagree with that, you'll be in another clashing position. Or maybe it's something to be conquered, like with pesticides and herbicides and whatever will kill the parts of nature we don't want. So you can see this gets complicated. Some psychologists have even suggested that nature is our collective unconsciousness. It's how we understand ourselves as human beings, as animals, as psyches. That gets a little hard to talk about. But maybe it's just things we own. You own your backyard, that's your piece of property to own. So I'm not advocating any one of these positions in particular, but I think you can see it's hard for them to get along. It's going to be a human project to work this out. So this kind of a disagreement happens in countries all over the world, clashing with their political impacts. Now, a third common challenge, or fourth actually, Ron, is that we know more and more now about the environmental impacts on human health. We cannot just separate environment and humans anymore. Just for a few examples here, we know quite clearly that when there's strong air pollution, that triggers a lot more asthma. Or that when there's strong water pollution, we have a lot more waterborne disease, etc. We now know tiny chemicals are working as endocrine disruptors. And we have emerging diseases all around the world that are, many of them, air and waterborne. So we can't pretend that human beings are not part of the environment. We are all struggling with these health impacts. So this litany is almost over. This is the really hard part here. But the take home really is that everywhere we're struggling with not just the environmental challenges, but a lot of uncertainty and a lot of very rapid change. Whether you talk about rapid economic change, which can be quite destabilizing around the world, or a sense of threat from different disasters. Wasn't last year kind of a banner year for disasters? So we're all a little bit like on the, tornado warnings go off. Is this a disaster coming or not? And the pervasiveness of toxins everywhere in so many of our soils and waters. So and then you get this sense of overload just in information. Well, fine, but actually I didn't really want to know all about that. It's too much. I can't handle it. So that's a real phenomenon too, what I'm calling cyber overload. That kind of sickness you can get from learning so much from the web and just finding out more and more and more. Now on top of that, it's actually pretty difficult to talk about. It's hard to talk about our fears and concerns. And I think part of my being here tonight is to invite that conversation and to say I think it's an important conversation that we should have with each other pretty continuously, because this is where we live. But I don't mean that it's easy, because look at some of the things that happen. When you start to talk about these things, you can fall into despair or frustration or a sense of helplessness, depression, discouragement. Now this is the place where I just need a little audience support. So anybody out there, if you've experienced any one of these states of mind in relationship to the environment, could you just raise your hand? All right, thank you very much. That helps me when I try to sleep at night, and I'm realizing at least I'm not alone with my concerns about this. So this struggle really is taking place in many forms around the world in many countries, and it's a real call for the religious traditions to bring some of their resources to this. So here's our question in the common challenge: how can we find a way forward and not just be paralyzed? How can we take care of the planet in a better way? How can we take care of our communities, our governance bodies, our economies, our health? All of it, it's all intertwined and linked up together. It's quite a tangled web. That's actually a phrase from a famous Buddhist koan, but it describes things very well, a tangled web. And it's not just that the economic, social, and environmental systems are intertwined with each other, but that some of these values and cultural formations in terms of governance and religions have a lot of conflict. And we're still dealing with choices other people made before us. We didn't make the choices that happened during earlier wars or during agricultural eras or earlier treatments of rivers or forests. They're hundreds of years still unfolding. So this is where we begin this talk. But look, I have a way forward, provided by Gus Speth. Gus Speth has been the dean of the school at the Yale School of Environment and Forestry, Environmental Studies and Forestry. He's retired at this point, but he was taking this set of common challenges himself. This book came out in 2004, and trying to figure out a way to organize some priorities. If we cannot deal with it all at once, how can we think about it to set what we should do in order? So I won't talk about all these, but I want you to see his organization, because the last one is the subject of our talk. So focusing on population, just in terms of sheer human impact, So he has suggestions there in this chapter. Poverty, technologies that will help us with managing our current work. Full cost pricing is a different way of doing economics. So you see already he's thinking in many different dimensions. Sustainable consumption, not wasteful consumption, such as, you know, safe packaging or eating more locally. You'll recognize some of these flavors. And then, of course, teaching each other and learning. So I know, at least in our program, environmental studies is very popular and is really on the rise. But all the areas that are teaching environment now, there's environment in anthropology, there's an environment in sociology, and you name it. It's really a growing field. And certainly thinking globally about governance. But the part in blue, this is what I'm getting to, which was a very revolutionary aspect of his writing. He said, none of this will really matter if we don't also have a significant transformation of consciousness, where we're shifting our valuing to the quality of life and the quality of our well-being in every aspect of what we look at. So he pointed to the need for a common ground for a paradigm shift. And paradigm shifts, there's a kind of bridge to a new place where you're using different values and finding a different way to frame something. So this was a manifesto, a kind of call. Will somebody please answer this call? Because he was in a school of forestry and environmental studies. He wasn't particularly a philosopher or someone coming from religion. But the people in religion recognized this right away. This is our territory. This is the kind of thing we do. We like to think about. So religion does have something to offer. So let's put a frame around that. And this actually came from some research by someone at the World Watch Institute, Gary Gardner. And he was thinking about religion because for the last 30 years, since the famous Lynn White article came out in the 1960s, the 30 years after that, they sort of went silent. The religions were not really engaged. And Gary Gardner started to think, but here's enormous numbers of people, enormous leadership out there. Why aren't the religions engaging? And he named what they could be doing. So first, they have many, many members. Think about how many Muslims there are in the world, how many Christians, how many Buddhists, etc. They carry tremendous moral authority for their followers and the believers. What's in the scriptures, or what's in the Quran, or what's in the Buddhist sutras. They offer ethical guidelines. They try to help people behave better. This is a very useful thing to do, so we won't hurt each other so much. So they carry this more than any other kind of cultural body in the world, the moral kind of authority and religious leadership. You have ministers, you have rabbis, you have imams, you have Buddhist priests that are quite willing to offer their authority as teachers. And this is, again, useful in this kind of conversation. They provide meaning, the religions do, by shaping worldviews, the creation stories, all the stories of the different traditions give a kind of platform, a place to take off and really think hard about things. And usually they're carrying some paradigm about a well-being of some sort, where communities get along well, or where they practice their religious traditions together well. Most religious traditions want human society to flourish. So this comes through in their paradigms for well-being. Now, a very practical thing is that religious traditions have places. They have churches, they have synagogues, they have cemeteries, they have retreat centers, they have cathedrals. And these are all potential sites for transformation of consciousness and for greening actions. So this is now a big part of this movement, is greening a sanctuary, putting solar panels on your roof, etc. But the physical resources themselves could serve these conversations that I'm talking about. And then, of course, all religions are focused on building community, and it's not very far of a stretch to build community that includes sustainability. Sustainability with the planet and, of course, also with your own community group. So now with that big frame of our common challenge and the role for religion, let's look at the role for Buddhism. So for those of you who have no idea much at all about Buddhism, here's your one slide to get a sense, at least geographically, of its journey from the southern states down there in Sri Lanka and India, and how it spread from the southern schools north to form the Mahayana schools in Japan and China and Korea, and further north into Tibet for the Vajrayana schools. And as you see, those arrows keep pointing west, and every one of those schools has now made it to the North American continent. So this is a tradition that easily adapts to many places. It's still very much in the minority. This is clearly a Judeo-Christian culture here. But through Buddhist-Christian dialogue and through the presence of Buddhists and some of the practices I'll bring up, Buddhism has made its way into this culture. So it is something to offer. But it's very old, just like some of the monotheistic traditions, originated way back in India, 500 BC, and at least you can get a sense of where it's traveled. But I'll give you a little bit about some of the main principles. But just for starters, about why Buddhists should be concerned, this is one of my major themes with any Buddhists I meet, is the fact that the Tibetan plateau holds as much ice in the Himalayas to be considered a third pole, it's sometimes called. You've got the Antarctic, the South Pole, and the North Pole at the Arctic, and these are two places we're watching very closely around climate change and ice retreat. But it's happening at equally the same pace in the Himalayas. And if you look at this slide, you'll see all these great rivers come right out from the Tibetan plateau. The Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Ganges, the Salween, the Mekong, Huanghe, the Yangtze, all the major river systems of Asia owe their origin to that Tibetan plateau. So what climate change does to that area is certainly going to affect all those cultures, and we really don't know how yet. And will it affect their religion? So I think that Western Buddhists in particular ought to be paying attention to this out of a sense of allegiance and loyalty to the root countries of their traditions. All right, back to the rest of Buddhism 101. The basic teachings that are common to all traditions are that the primary moral guideline is based on non-harming. If you don't remember any of the other precepts or don't read any sutras, but you, as the Dalai Lama says, you just try to be a kind person, that will take you a long ways from a Buddhist perspective. Non-harming, it comes from the Hindu tradition of ahimsa, but it's lifted right up as the key ethical principle. Then philosophically, Buddhism sees the world as a web of interdependent causes and conditions. There's no single cause and effect. And you'll always be able to see, oh, all those things over there were causing that, and then it generated all these effects. They're systems thinkers. So this works very, very well with an ecological perspective. And personally, that's what really drew me to Buddhism. I was already thinking ecologically, and this just seemed to make so much sense. Then the actual religious project or philosophical project, sort of for the human soul journey, you might say, is that through meditation and insight and study, you can be liberated from suffering. So this starts from the basis that everybody suffers, I could go on, but in different ways, whether you have little complaints about the aches of your bones, or you have major heartaches, or you can't stand war. Something about the human condition, being born, going through old age, sickness, and death and dying, there will be an experience of suffering. But in the midst of that, through understanding this condition, one can be liberated from such a deep experience of that suffering. So that's the sort of hope, to relieve that suffering. And that the Buddhist practices strengthen your capacity for insight and for setting an intention in that direction and for developing compassion for others. So that's a very quick overview, but then obviously the traditions vary tremendously. So just these few pictures, we have some South Asian Buddhists, a Tibetan Buddhist who's working the prayer wheels, and a Japanese temple. So it's a very, very rich tradition. But what I'll be trying to do is translate some of what's come from the East to the West, and I'm clearly thinking this through as a Western Buddhist. What does it look like if you try to put some of these Buddhist teachings forward to think about the environment? And here I did say Zen because that's the tradition I know the best. I can speak a little about the others. I'm not exactly a Buddhist scholar per se. I'm really an environmentally concerned person using these humanities tools. So this is what I came up with. What Zen Buddhism can offer are in these four areas, and we'll spend a little time in each of them going through what's on the list here. But I thought you might really like this Buddha. Isn't that kind of unusual? It's very, very green Buddha. with that tree growing very much out of it. And I know what this refers to is when the Buddha attained enlightenment, he was sitting by a tree. It looks like it's growing out of his head, but I think he's actually sitting next to the tree. And he, at the time, did this mudra with his hand touching the earth at the very near the end of his enlightenment sitting period. Through the night, he was tortured by all kinds of delusions. And it was said that he was held still against them, lust and greed and desire and the dancing maidens and every possible thing, like a long night of bad dreams. But they really questioned him, tried to make him doubt what he was doing. And he reached down and touched the earth as his grounding point. So environmentalists really like this story a lot. Touching the earth, sitting by a tree, some kind of sense that this was part of the source of his wisdom. That's what we speculate anyway, but I wasn't there, so I can't really be sure. So let's look at what I mean by skillful means for starting. Skillful means is a Buddhist phrase, upaya in Sanskrit, and it means working in a situation using what's appropriate. What's really the appropriate technique or teaching to relieve suffering in a certain situation. Now you can think of this very practically. I mean, the way the Buddha talked about it, and as the teachings come down, is that you would skillfully use certain teachings with different audiences. So you wouldn't try to give an hour-long lecture to a 5-year-old, right? That would be very unskillful means. Likewise, you probably wouldn't sit an adult down and expect them to read a children's book as their major source of learning. So he's very skillfully oriented. What will be effective? This has also been said to be like the way a doctor thinks. You give the right medicine and the right dose for the condition that you're diagnosed here. So upaya is said to be the heart of compassionate response. And if we're thinking ethically, what this means is you first are trying to completely understand the condition of the person or the ecosystem, whatever you're treating. You have to compassionately understand what's going on in that situation before you can really offer help. So it's really that the help and the response is based on what's needed and what can actually be received with open hands. Now, I will parenthetically put a footnote here, as Western environmental activists sometimes aren't so good at this. That we often think that we know the answer without even really diagnosing it well or acting compassionately for all the people of different points of view that are out there. Environmentalists can be very assertive and sometimes tough on other people. So one of the Buddhist offerings is very much about listening and responding with inclusive compassion to all the parties that are involved in some difficult situation. And in the middle of that, upaya also means setting an intention toward being skillful, saying, we're in this situation. And so setting intention is a big part of Buddhist practice too. What's really needed? What can I do? What will be effective? This phrase in there, that's a hidden advising phrase that I use every time I meet with students. What can you actually do? And it's a great way to focus your attention and not feel too terrible about all the things you can't do that aren't in front of you to do. What's your part to do? So it's a way of seeing the web. And this picture is from the Buddhist Peace Fellowship doing some mindfulness meditation to bring calm to what otherwise would be a difficult protest. And that was their contribution. So one of the ways that's offered through both the Buddhist teachings in the sutras and very strong today in modern Western Buddhism is the practice of mindfulness. In fact, there's a brand new magazine out called Mindful. I just got an issue the other day. It's full of many good tips, I must say. This was promoted in the United States by one of the beloved teachers here, Thich Nhat Hanh, with his little bell, who does walking practice with mindfulness and especially loves leading children on this. So cultivating mindfulness is a kind of medicine for the suffering that I'm talking about, because it specifically orients you to being present in the moment as it is. Not in the one that's coming or the one you worried about in the past, but being able to deal, it's a kind of disaster preparedness. That's how I've been thinking about it lately, that mindfulness could really come in handy in disasters. But it's a way to add calmness deliberately into a situation, because at least the person practicing the mindfulness is present with what's going on and not so scattered. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this as restoring the natural inward measure. I don't know exactly what he means, but I think it's a sense of internal balance, confidence, and a capacity to respond, even when whatever's going on, terrible weather or delayed airlines, etc. So from his perspective, it's really, that's what we have to offer as human beings, just being present with each other. So I'm thinking this in a very pragmatic way, offering calmness, capacity for difficulty, but it is now being used in a number of places. So this isn't just a pie in the sky kind of a thing. In our mind, there's a number of practices out there around mindfulness in eating, both as a way to, strangely enough, lose weight, but also to be conscious of what you are eating. Where was it made? How was it produced? How was it prepared? Who was the cook? How far was it shipped? Those kinds of things can become a little personal meditation if you're practicing mindfulness with food. There's mindfulness leadership training going on that's very secular. It's not about Buddhism. It's about how to be a different kind of leader. Mindfulness-based stress reduction. I hear you have this right on your own campus, MBSR training. And this has become very good for dealing with chronic pain. It's through the hospital system, where they're using some of these techniques of breathing and practicing being very present in the moment that come straight out of Buddhist practice, but to help people with chronic suffering, physical suffering. And it's turned out to be quite effective. Many scientific papers written about that. In my own school district right south of Burlington, they're doing mindfulness practices in the schools, and it's turning out to be extremely effective. And the way they do it, so this is a picture from those kids there. The middle school kids really like it, and high school too, because they're so stressed out all the time. And the way the teachers, they have many different little techniques, but it's often a minute or two of silence at the beginning of class. It might be a little bell. Could be a guided meditation. It might be heads down on your desk. It's a little timeout period for the student to return to himself or herself after the scurry between classes and the quiz in the last period. Anyway, they found that the students do much better on exams. They're much happier. And what they call it resilience training, that it's in character building. So the idea is that if students are more centered while they're under all this stress, they will become better citizens, happier people, more able to help others. And they're finding really very interesting, great results. So I think this is going to spread. There's a whole movement about mindfulness in the schools, mindfulness in the hospitals. I'm hearing now about mindfulness in prisons, and even mindfulness in legal practice. So that's all about how to offer compassion and kindness in all these different realms where there's a lot of stress. Now, I will say I have not seen that much Buddhist training in mindfulness for environmentalists, a little bit. But it's not one of the big areas just yet. Instead, what I think we see is that there are Buddhists scattered among environmental activists or environmental organizations or environmental professors who just try to bring whatever they can into that arena. But it's not nearly as big as in the hospitals, etc. So that's the mindfulness practice. Now, second one I put in here is non-ego-based action. That's a very Buddhist phrase there, because one of the Buddhist liberation projects is to stop being so involved in yourself and having a distorted view of the world as only the way you see it, and breaking through that to seeing that as more of a false view of self, to the bigger interdependent view. That takes a lot of work, but it can be actually worked on in individual circumstances. So this is taking that law of interdependence and practicing it where ego and power are engaged. So if you go to any town meeting, just think of a public hearing, faculty meeting, club meeting of students, you're going to see people exercising their power and their ego, right? And you've all seen people that really get in the way of the process. They're trying to get a decision made, and the ego gets in the way. So a Buddhist way of engaging skillful means is to tamp that ego down and be working more for the collective good than for your celebration of your own personality. Not that easy to do. But it depends on practicing self-reflection as part of that. So that's a major theme all the way out through the Buddhist tradition as a strong monastic tradition, and this filters through even the non-monastic practice, is reflecting back on, well, how really am I personally behaving, or is my community behaving? taking the time to look at that and assess and reconfigure. So here's just a few examples, you know, compared to Christians and Jews and Muslims, especially in Western North America, there's not going to be as many Buddhist examples. It's just too small. But one group I work with, the Center for Whole Community, is a conservation training group, and they're very strong on the diversity concerns around power and privilege, and as well as conservation. And they use mindfulness and awareness practice as a way to help their participants have better conversations with each other. So I've taught meditation there, but I teach it as kind of an environmentalist. It's in Vermont, very interesting community. And this group, Buddhist Peace Fellowship, that I've mentioned to some of you, which is an activist group from the Buddhist side, has, you know, done their sit-ins in Wall Street, but the way they do their sit-ins is on their meditation cushions. And again, to provide a kind of island of calm. So the idea, take-home thing here that matches up with the last one is reducing self-interest will generally result in stronger outcomes and more sustainable outcomes because more people have worked on them together rather than it being sort of ego-driven. So I'm laying out a kind of Buddhist framework here for this. So the third skillful means here I'm bringing up is practicing equanimity. And this is seen as one of the most greatest virtues in the Buddhist pantheon of virtues. It's very difficult, but it can be practiced under all circumstances. So you have endless practice opportunities. And this really gives you a chance to be completely present with the suffering without going into a lot of reactivity. It's often if you see somebody suffering or the ecosystem suffering or forest suffering, you know, you want to be angry or cry, or I mean, there's a lot of emotional response around things where they're suffering. So practice of equanimity is to be so familiar with those emotional states that you're able to stay steady for others under those circumstances. Stay centered, even while the conditions are changing. Now, why I think that's so important is that environmental systems are changing. We're going to have new, different versions of drought, tornado, sea level rise, climate change, all those things. We don't really know how we're going to respond, but we could begin by building our own resilience and character and developing more stability and calmness. So it's all has to do with, you know, how stressed the world is getting. But as the Dalai Lama said here, you know, I saw him in the St. Louis airport. There was a sign there, and I was so happy to see the Dalai Lama on one of the billboards. It really surprised me, but it looked just like this. Because we all share this planet Earth, we have to learn in harmony and peace with each other, and to live in harmony and peace with each other and with nature. This is not just a dream, but a necessity. One of the Dalai Lama's great contributions in modern times has been to develop a secular ethics that's based on his Buddhist principles, but it's mostly based on kindness. And what he's written about is easily translatable to all the other faith traditions. And he's very, very concerned about environmental issues. Very particularly because Tibet is under a lot of environmental destruction right now under the governance of the Chinese. So stability and calmness could increase the possibility for insight and kindness in a stressful world. I think you probably would all agree with that earlier uncertainty and change, the common challenge. So let's just have a moment of enjoying some calmness by this beautiful path through the redwoods. You can call it back into your mind how it is to be in a forest setting. So we started with skillful means, the kind of practices, the diagnoses, the things you can actually do. So now let's look at some ethical guidelines, some principles, some philosophies, some things that you can turn back to if you were drawing on the Buddhist tradition and see if they make sense in terms of working with environmental suffering, environmental challenges. Now, all religious traditions urge people to live by an ethical compass, and they lay out the different formulas for that, and there's, you know, many sayings, the Bible's full of them, Proverbs and the Psalms and many of the teachings. So we know these are throughout all the religious traditions. And the same is true in all the Buddhist teachings as well. So let me just pull a few of the key things out. But all ethical guidelines ask for people to act with restraint. That means choosing not to do something that might hurt somebody else. So if the first Buddhist precept says to not harm others, just like one of the commandments says do not kill, you will get along better in human society choosing to restrain from killing others or harming others. So it's practicing restraint, which means developing a certain level of self-awareness and maturity to be able to do that on behalf of social stability. Now, I would suggest here this might mean, in a society that's, goes through its ups and downs with this, we're not the most stable society here in the US, we might need to reinvest our time and energy, even maybe our money and relationships in different ways. Should you take this up, you'd think, well, what will help me with this the most? But the Buddhist ethical compass would be never forgetting that the environment is really reflecting you, yourself, each human individual, and vice versa. That that's an intertwined thing. That the health of my own well-being depends completely on that environment. Never forgetting that. Now, one place this has gotten focused by some Buddhist activists is around abuse, particularly animal abuse, and people that are looking at some of the animal rights and animal welfare issues, because it so clearly harms and hurts animals, and it's an easy place to ask the question, is there another way to do this with less harming? But I also put down here looking at cultural conditioning, because we have a lot of ways that we talk about things that maligns parts of the environment, or name calling, or stereotypes, or issues around power, and to look at that takes a little bit of work. But that helps point back to these ethical questions. So the basic ethical questions boil down to, I think, what's really needed. This was the compassionate response. And how can my own actions, the only ones I have real responsibility for, reduce suffering? So that's what the ethical process is, the kind of constant self-reflection. How am I being a moral person? How am I finding a way to serve others? So the first one, the non-harming, the way this is expressed in the Mahayana traditions, and that's the Zen Buddhist tradition I'm part of, is that you take a vow when you go through, well, actually, in any of the regular services, it'd be like going to church or something. You always say this over and over again. But when you also go through lay ordination or priest ordination, you take the Bodhisattva vow. And the Bodhisattva is the one who comes back to the world to help over and over again for all kinds of suffering that's there, no matter how enlightened he or she is, comes back to help the rest of us who are still struggling. So it's one of these impossible vows. You cannot live up to it. You cannot do it all perfectly, but you just keep trying. And it's basically that you vow to reduce harm and to practice kindness and to act with restraint. That's basically what it boils down to. If you chant it in Japanese, it sounds pretty cool, but that's what it really boils down to. But once you've taken it, when I went through this lay ordination practice, a senior student of my teacher said to me, up until now, you've been practicing Buddhism for yourself. This is just personally to relieve your own suffering, take care of things that bother you. But once you take this vow, you're practicing on behalf of all others, and everything you do is to serve others. So it's a pretty serious vow. So that's one way to express this ethical principle of non-harming in the Mahayana traditions. In the southern traditions, the ones down in Thailand and Vietnam and so on, there's quite an emphasis on the teachings on contentment, on choosing to actually be satisfied, to enjoy the life that you have, and to turn from the influences that are making you dissatisfied, to actually identify what they are, whether it's certain kinds of foods or drink or people or weather, but somehow working towards well-being for self and others through even the infrastructure that you develop, and turning away from these states of craving. So choosing contentment. As a little footnote on the side, this was a very popular teaching in Vietnam at the time of the Vietnamese War, because that's a Buddhist, and in Thailand, it's a Buddhist country, and the American advisors were quite worried that Thailand was going to cooperate with the Vietnamese and so on. It was the whole bloc was going to fall. And they were particularly disturbed by this teaching of contentment, and talked to the Buddhist patriarchy there and asked them to stop teaching it, because they thought if the people were so satisfied with life as it was, they would not be open to the changes that were going to be coming from the West, particularly around markets and consumption and selling things. And it was interesting how political this particular teaching got at that time. They're bringing it back though now. It's good. So I've put a few choices of places people are working with this around food choices, mobility. By that I mean your transportation. How do you get around? Thinking about degrees of harm. So there's a lot of discussion around this now. Train versus plane versus bus versus bike versus walking. And some cities like Portland, where I'm doing this bicycle commuting quality of life project, the infrastructure is shifting to reduce the harm from the higher carbon emitting vehicles, the cars, and the support of the lower carbon emitting vehicles, the bicycles. And they're putting it into their whole city plan. Though I don't think they would call it a Buddhist project, but it at least lines up with this kind of approach. So that creating sustainability for the long term is a sum of all these. Stating it in a Buddhist way. You might say it differently in a city plan, but that sustainability would be the goal. So practicing restraint, where and how? Well, particularly those of you who are interested in that book, Hooked, that I worked on, it's around desire. And the desire for things and for more stuff, and the third garage and the seventh pair of skis, or I don't know, water skis maybe it is out here. But identifying where those cravings are, how the hooked thing happens, and then trying to take it apart. And Buddhism has a tremendous amount of teachings to offer in this particular area. They're really good on psychology. They really know the human nature to just grab for the thing that will make you feel better. So the way they categorize this, just quick Buddhism 101, is you can either desire more of something. You just, that first ice cream cone was great. I think I'll have another one. Or less of something, aversion. You just, you don't want to go near it, so you're kind of pushing away. Or for the kind of delusional sense, you don't really, something you want, some fantasy or some illusion. So they boil all different emotional states down into these kinds of three drives, I guess you could say. And the idea of studying it is to cause less harm through the unconscious triggers there. So self-awareness of desire and practicing restraint then becomes the basis for what Gus Speth was talking about, that transformation of consciousness. He didn't have a recipe, and he wasn't particularly talking about Buddhism as the dean of, the Yale School of Environment and Forestry, but taking his call, this is kind of my response, that this is what can be personally and socially transformative. And when you enact or enable or manifest this really caring for others as self and thinking ecologically, thinking interdependence, then you could follow these very primary guidelines. They start right with the non-harming, but you'll recognize some of these. They're very similar to some of the Christian precepts, some of the Jewish guidelines as well. Not taking what is not given, that's not stealing, but you could see it environmentally. Not participating in abusive relations, that usually refers to sexual relations, but I've rephrased it here as abusive because there's many other relationships that people can be abusive in, with their pets or with their backyards, etc. So really thinking, how can I be less abusive? Not lying, not speaking falsely about what's going on in the world. This calls for a lot of environmental truth-telling. And not using intoxicating substances. That usually refers in the precepts to alcohol or drugs. But Thich Nhat Hanh has expanded that to be intoxicating behaviors. Things where we are deluded by what the impacts of those behaviors are, and so we just want to keep doing them. So we could spend the whole rest of tonight just on these and how you might interpret them environmentally. But I just wanted to give you a taste of, if you just worked with 5 guidelines, where that would lead you environmentally. But even if it weren't those guidelines, if you were working with a different faith tradition, you could still see that people trying to practice a set of ethical guidelines help to create a more ethical society, and then the reverse happens as well. A more ethical society asks people to behave more ethically, and it evolves in a more positive and a more kind and a more civil way. We're definitely seeing this conversation very strongly right now on the gun control issue, right? And trying to create more more ethical society, and trying to figure out how to do that, how to get there, and how to make people more behave more ethically. It's obviously we haven't solved it. We're still really trying to work our way through. Now the fourth one I'll add under ethical guidelines is this taking the long view, and this works very well with, again, environmental perspectives, which takes the long view of evolution or geologic history, how things take a long time to change sometimes, and much has been created over a long time, but also seeing the past as directly linked to what we're living in the present, really understanding it that way. Now, one of the biggest advantages of this gift from Buddhism is that it's a corrective for our very short-term thinking. Particularly in the last 5-10 years, we're just faster and faster. We can't get it fast enough on our laptops. It's got to be on our Blackberries, and everything is so speedy in our society. It's just the way we do business now. And short-term thinking used to be 10 years. Now maybe it's 1 year. Maybe it's a day. I'm not sure. So this is, our human minds are just moving at such a clip that this is a particular kind of practice that is a good balancing point for that. And I gave you a little picture here. You never guessed this, but this is the plaque at Cape Newigin on Southport Island in Maine, where Rachel Carson's ashes were scattered. Because that's one of her greatest gifts from her environmental ethics is this long view, and she pointed out in her writing some of the virtues that develop from that. Patience, a greater sense of perspective, humility, and the capacity to endure. She saw serenity without writing any of this in Buddhist language about that. So a little moment of the deep view. Our own Mount Mansfield, the Green Mountain Range. Those of you who like to get up to higher places, call back to mind what that is, the long, long view, eons. Well, those were the big topics. Skillful means, ethical guidelines. Now it gets a little harder as we pull towards the close of this talk. New paradigms for well-being. That's really what Gus Beth was asking for. Does Buddhism have a role in this? In a popular way, or in a religious way, or in an academic way? Well, this is one place where a lot is going on and evolving, and I think it probably is Buddhist influenced, though you wouldn't ever see that maybe in the academic paper coming out. So some of the things I'm mentioning here are relational thinking, a practice path approach, and seeking green wisdom. So let's first define a little bit about well-being. It's fairly easy to get a general sense of it on an individual level. That's good health, satisfying work, good relationships, general sense that life is more or less, you have some control over your own life. At the social level, you want to see that also happening in civil society, that you have governance structures that work, you have a healthy community, market structures that support that basically society works. Globally is perhaps the biggest challenge, global well-being, although the brave country of Bhutan is advancing that at the UN level to say maybe we could measure our global well-being in terms of happiness. I actually suggested instead of gross domestic product, let's have gross national happiness. And they're trying to figure out the metrics. And it's not really a joke in their countries. How can we measure schools in terms of gross national happiness? But I added here spiritual well-being from a Buddhist point of view is based on the Eightfold Path of the Four Noble Truths. And these are some of the parts of that. Right relationship. Just thinking intuitively about this. I don't think I need to explain much. Or things are okay with yourself and community. Right relationships with the natural world. Being able to be ethically clear and exercise restraint. And then tolerance for the other parts of the path. So practicing relational thinking comes right out of the Buddhist law of interdependence. Not thinking of the things as separate. There's the tree and here am I, but what's my relationship with the tree? And always thinking in systems perspectives. Of course, I teach environmental studies, so we're always teaching systems thinking, but about feedback and control and flow of energy and what's influencing what. And this is way markets are analyzed, ecosystems are analyzed, climate is analyzed, so it's really the centerpiece of most of today's sciences, is systems thinking. The Chinese use the phrase qi or qi, that's life force. But the key in my phrase here is experiencing it, really feeling this as part of the paradigm so that you can act relationally. And I've a nice quote here from Gary Snyder, who is one of the first Buddhist poets to really be very popular in America and write about the environment in a new way. So I won't read that all the way through, but a sense of the holographic shape of the universe, all one mosaic within another. So that's the way of thinking relationally. Which means that if you do, you understand self in a different way. From the Buddhist perspective, you would see self as a process, more something constantly in change, impermanent, changing, rather than a perfectly settled identity, and less of an object. Thich Nhat Hanh coined the term interbeing, and Joanna Macy the term ecological self. And they were trying to get people to think, well, what does that mean, interbeing? In fact, he stretched a little too far, Thich Nhat Hanh, when he turned it into the verb form inter-are. And we were waiting for inter-is, and it just kind of wasn't working. But we got what he was trying to say. At the environmentalist retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, interbeing means you can't be yourself alone without the being of someone else. So it's a bit trying to get a graphic here, and it didn't really come out too well. That I see it digitized on the screen, but the web, the great web of life. Now, in my book, Mindfully Green, I talked about taking a practice path approach to this. And what I mean is drawing directly from the religious traditions. And, you know, in the Catholic tradition, you have the novitiate, and so on. You sign up, you go to the monastery. Same with the Buddhists. You can train for a week or a month. All the Thai young men go into the monastery for some time, usually a year. And you learn how to just make that at the center of your life if you take a practice path approach. So in that book, Mindfully Green, I talk about taking the green path, the environmental path, as a practice path. That once you start asking these questions about sustainability and environmental health and green products, it's hard to turn around and go back. And pretty soon you're asking them all the time, and it's sort of your way of life. So I just wanted to name that. A practice path approach is a committed ethical approach. And it means at the heart of it, there's a real orientation to well-being for all. And it's continual reaffirmation of intention and practicing ethically, but that you start as a beginner, but you keep, you know, kind of getting better as you go along and helping others along the way. So I think this Buddha in particular must have been deep on the practice path a very, very long time. Looks very contented there. Now this isn't spelled out particularly in the Buddhist sutras, so this is my own creative initiative here about seeking green wisdom, because I've had a lot of very strong experiences with this, and the other places I've worked and the places I've lived. And so, when I tell other people about it, when I wrote this book about tree experiences, they all brought all their tree stories up to me. And I wrote to my students in class too. People want to share their stories about their green wisdom. So now I'm just going to call it out, that it's possible to receive teachings from an inner being perspective, from not just the Buddha or the, Jesus or any of the great teachers, but from all these other beings who've been around a really long time too, like this beautiful Fern Canyon in Northern California. That you can deliberately seek places for green wisdom and follow the paths that others have been on. So when I first named the teachers and the teachings I had followed, that's part of it, a path that somebody has, laid down and you can walk as well. Gary Snyder talks about practicing wild mind, even the bigger path, the sort of, you would say in Zen, the original face of, like with life arising. So I'm not even sure what all that means, but to even try to do it and to go seeking is a kind of ethical and spiritual practice path, seeking green wisdom. So here's one of Rachel Carson's places that she sought green wisdom, Ocean Point in Maine. And I've done quite a bit of work reading her materials and writing about her, and it was really a thrill to try to imagine what her green practice path was before the environmental movement hardly began. But to go to these places and see the tides in and out at Ocean Point is a little bit of a taste. Well, we're just about done here, but we cannot forget the community part of this. This isn't just about doing it all on your own, as Western individualists might tend to think. because that's the way we think about most things. In fact, Bill McKibben calls us a hyper-individualist society. So this, in some ways, is the hardest thing for Western Buddhist practitioners, is the community part. So, but I found some Buddhist statues for that too, see? So in Buddhist philosophy, they talk about the three jewels, and you pledge a kind of allegiance to the three jewels, and they are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and you do sets of bows every day for that and so on. The Buddha makes sense. That's the main teacher and all the other teachers, and the Dharma is the teachings, but the Sangha are the people that you're trying to learn all this stuff with. So that might be your environmentalists or your Buddhists, in this case, either, but the people, the community of friends practicing together. So there are things that can only be done by groups. Policies can be changed or enforced or suggested. Major physical building projects, partnerships across cultures like these Interfaith Power and Light, the things they're doing and working with other cultures to install renewable energy. So I just made a kind of a list of the things that I read about all the time in the environmental newsletters and magazines I get. They're not necessarily Buddhist, but the Buddhists would think this would all make a lot of sense because it makes sense in a very sustainable way to just build a practical, functional, loving society that's based more on kindness and in the actual place. So my sense is that leadership informed by that kind of practice will generate confidence in other people, and we really need this kind of faith-based leadership to inform our environmental work because it will help people really get to the concern at hand through the speaking clearly and calmly and modeling resilience. Resilience is the really big word right now in adaptation and climate change. And I think we're going to see more and more of it, but it can also have a spiritual and religious underpinning. And this is what will set us up for that uncertainty I began with. So it's just like, well, that's just how things are. Can we just roll with it, like surfers, and hold these paradoxes of conflicting values? Can we be with that? Now, one person writing on this new kind of leadership talks about needing to be familiar with grief work. I'll just leave that as a little footnote to think about. When people are upset about losses from disasters or environmental losses, it's hard to know how to deal with them. So the skilled leader, she's saying, needs to be okay, needs to be able to function with some amount of grief work. So trying to tie this all together in our last couple of slides, then ethical guidelines would help stabilize communities, build more kindness and respect, and head us towards kind of social norms that are very functional. So see how the Buddhist philosophy is working here. So we can be in this tangled web, but as an effective agent, and then pass those values on to the next generation. That it has to keep moving through a culture to get established. And then the new paradigms for well-being would completely help us be present for what arises, since we don't really know what it's going to be. But it might help us recalibrate and keep the focus more on the richness of our immediate experience, our immediate relationships with this kind of full presence. So I've tried to tie this all together here. It looks much neater than it is to do. It's really very messy, and we just make mistakes all the time and constantly are trying and falling down and doing better, and the Buddhists aren't really any better at it than anybody else. But I thought you might enjoy seeing how a frame of it could all be put together. And we'll just end with a few kind of uplifting photos here. That this kind of deep view, that long view with intention might build a mindful society. Since, as Gary Snyder says, we're all indigenous to this planet, this beautiful mosaic. And to work in a place is to work with others, is to build community. And in that way, working with the wild to restore culture. These sunflowers just popping up in an old barn seems like that. And my old mentor, my green wisdom mentor, watering tomato plants, I just think is the greatest picture. Dalai Lama with a watering can. This kind of society full of beautiful food grown by people that care about it, enjoying being outside. This is one of my bike commuters in Portland, and passing those values on to the little ones. So thank you very much for your attention, and to my hosts here, Dr. Callahan, for arranging this talk. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and we have time for some questions. And I did dedicate this in the Buddhist tradition, that it go beyond this room to all the other beings too. Thank you. So, questions, thoughts? I went a little longer than I expected to, but I kept adding footnotes. Yeah.
Are there any initiatives in the professional, corporate, or political sphere that you think are especially exemplary of what you're talking about, Buddhism and
That's a good question. In this magazine I mentioned, the Mindful magazine, on the cover is Congressman Tim Ryan sitting in meditation. So I just read that whole article on the plane. Well, Tim Ryan is he's trained in the mindfulness-based stress reduction. He thinks Congress is a really stressful place. And we can imagine that's true. And so he's got a little place for meditation that can happen, and he's inviting people to come and do it. And he's doing it on this practical, resilience-based thing. Like, we have a lot of stress here. Would you just like to come and sit down and be quiet for 15 minutes? Maybe it'll help you do your job better. So he's quite a proponent for it. I think he might have a book coming out about this. And just the fact that that exists in Congress, I find really interesting. And that he's willing to sit publicly on a magazine cover in a meditation posture, a congressman in a suit and everything. So there's definitely that. But an even more interesting one is at the huge corporation Google. I mean, huge. They have a huge program going around their creativity initiatives based in mindfulness practice, and they teach meditation. They have a whole training program. It's optional. It's not a required thing, but the employees, it really works with their culture, their business culture. It's very popular, and it provides a kind of open space for the imagination there, and it's really feeding that company. So that's one that, I forget the exact name of that. Somebody else here might have it. They're doing training workshops all the time. So if Google's out there, so different corporations, Apple has a certain amount of this too, so it kind of depends who their leaders are and whether they're interested. But they're seeing that anything that will calm the mind will also free it to do really good, creative, innovative thinking, and every business wants that. So those are a couple examples, yeah. Questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I guess this is more of a comment. I personally went through cognitive behavioral therapy, and they talked a lot about mindfulness. And it never really struck me that it could be any good for the environment at all, so thank you.
I made the link. Yeah. Yeah, there are some people doing psychological work that are starting to make this link more and more, and seeing how our minds work is very strongly influencing how we act towards the environment, and also some of the environmental cues are strongly influencing how our mind works. So it can be everything from amount of sunlight out there to electrical charges in the air to amount of green space around you. So this is a very fertile part of, there's several fields: conservation psychology, eco-psychology, environmental psychology, all looking in this area. And I think we're going to see more and more coming out, especially with the development in the neurosciences around how the mind works. We're just getting a lot more capacity to study that. So see, you're on the advanced guard. Yeah. Yeah.
I have, I guess, two questions about the doctrine of upaya. And one of them has to do with this last point you made about changing the culture, because it's very easy for us to convince academic folk like ourselves that we need to do this kind of thing. It's much different to go out and convince society as a whole that they need to start recycling and stop driving that Hummer and so on. And so I'm wondering, culturally, how do we bring about this change, particularly when many people may not be receptive to, the Buddhist source of these things?
Sure.
So that's kind of my first upaya question. The second upaya question has to do with the strange way in which upaya typically manifests itself in the Zen tradition. I'm thinking particularly of Master Nansen cutting the cat in half to teach his pupils about attachment and detachment and so on. And I'm wondering how this might apply to like environmental activism and these types of things. Exactly how far might one push the envelope? The organizations like PETA or Greenpeace that do sometimes cat-cutting-like things in the name of environmental activism.
Yeah, I don't know how strong the Buddhist influence is in PETA. And animal rights people are very concerned about abusive relations, and they're really taking a lot of risks right now. Yeah, with their current branding of eco-terrorism. They probably could use a little mindfulness-based stress reduction training. Would help them. But so I think I can't say too much about their tactics right now. I think the jury's sort of out on that. I've been really amazed to watch the level of concern and risk, and I think it's you know, there's a law now, a proposed law before Congress that it would be illegal to take photos or video inside slaughterhouses, and they're directly going after the people who have been doing that and been exposing really unsafe practices. So we don't have good food inspection policies, and we really, you know, if there's problems with that, why don't we just mount cameras in them and check it later? So they're asking for transparency and safety. And their concerns we really should all be sharing, because it's sort of terrorist concerns. I mean, anybody could poison our food system so easily in so many ways. So, but they're kind of being labeled in the typical way. So that one I've just been reading about too and trying to really understand. It's very deeply motivated, and I think there's some strongly ethical people there willing, like others had before, to kind of carve a path, and we'll see how far it keeps going. But as far as the first one about upaya and trying to get society to move forward, this feels like the question my koan with my environmental studies students. It must be the question that's asked the most often in every environmental studies class. And unfortunately, there's a premise in it that is problematic to begin with. How can we get them to do what we want them to do? Well, that's really pretty aggressive. And from a Buddhist point of view, extremely unskillful. That is not skillful means. That's called bullying. That's like, my ideas are better than yours, and so I'm going to push you around until I've got you under my thumb and you'll do them. So I mean, a lot of our society does work that way, so environmentalists aren't really any different. It's a very legalistic society, and this society can be very aggressive too. But that being said, I'll just tell you the way I've done this in my own way. I call it, I took this from Sulaxi Viraksa, working as a small b Buddhist. I don't go into the faculty senate and say, hi, I'm your vice president, Stephanie Kaza, a Buddhist. And never. I don't care if they know that, or it's irrelevant. But I keep a very clear sense of what's going to work now. We have a new president. Now what's going to work? Oh, we're getting a new provost. Then what will work? What could happen that couldn't happen before because the causes and conditions weren't aligned? What's the skillful means thing to try and get that done now? So I think the insight is much more useful. And I try to caution our students, we're always trying to take apart stereotypes. I've been very excited anytime we can offer environment and business classes, so people won't pit those against each other. And this year I had the first class in military and the environment by one of our grad students, which again, same thing, let's just learn about what's the military doing, what it's history. It's doing a lot of energy initiative. So those stereotypes that come through environmentalism are really enemy making. So taking some of that apart. So that's been one of my approaches, is continuing to think about causes and conditions and let's not waste all my energy against a brick wall if nothing's going to move there right now. But then there's an opening. So, you know, I know your school is enrolled in this sustainability tracking and assessment rating system, STARS. Our school is one of the leading schools in this, University of Vermont. But our causes and conditions were not set up to be able to enroll in it. For 5 years, I kept asking the provosts, this is ridiculous. We have an incredible Office of Sustainability. People all over the country know about University of Vermont. Why aren't we enrolled in this thing? No, we just can't do that right now. Okay. So as soon as we got this new president, I was like, he's from Minnesota. They're enlightened up there. And they were enrolled in STARS. I said, now is our time. So he signed us up at the end of this long report and research I did for him. So I think skillful means is a really profound concept. if you take it all the way down to its roots and definitely question yourself, is this really going to work right now? If it isn't, let me put my energy somewhere else. And maybe I'm not even the one to be leading this. Is there a person somewhere else that's better positioned that can actually have the better conversation? And then I'll just lightly suggest to them, well, maybe this would be a good conversation to have, even though it's not me. So sometimes you have to see what your own shortcomings are in that. But if you have a relational view and a systems view, it really helps that upaya thing of thinking all parts of the system could be doing something effective. It's not necessarily all on me. And that really offers a greater range of skillful possibilities. And I'm very excited about that campus-wide, because this campus sustainability movement is all about that. One campus says, hey, we can do this. And then somebody else says, hey, look, they're doing that. And then they say, we could do it too. And it's grown so fast. It's one of the fastest growing environmental movements. And campuses are influencing each other all over to change their recycling, change their energy sources. It's phenomenal how much change has happened. And it's this kind of skillful means trading, back and forth of best practices. So it really works. Anyway, kind of a long answer to that thought, but yeah, back there.
Well, I've been thinking a lot lately about the precept of not taking what's freely given and how that correlates with the environmental movement, especially when we think of energy issues.
Yeah.
And, when you think of wind and sun is something that's freely given from the environment, where how extractive, gas or oil, and then just through this talk thinking about using that same precept of consumerism and how we're getting things from the third world, and that freely given that we have to, the labor that's being used.
There's much to reflect on in there. It's really true. A lot of fortunes have been made on stealing things that were just lying around for the pickings, whether it was gorgeous forests or huge whales. I mean, it's really the story of a lot of recent modern history. But I think that is the attraction of the renewable energies. There's something that feels ethical about it. We don't talk about it in ethical terms, but it's a sense that it does less damage overall. Just receiving solar rays doesn't seem to hurt the sun, right? So you just put your plates out, but of course you still have to make them, and how the manufacturing process, what are the wakes that come from that. There's nothing that's perfect. So this is one of the hardest things around energy, is that people talk about the energy wedges, and well, we're going to shift from this to this, and if we can get off coal, that's better, but that means we're doing all this natural gas, and then there is issues about natural gas. So we have this yearning, which is always true around ethics. You have the yearning towards the ideal. You can almost imagine it, and that's really your kind of compass point. But in terms of energy, this isn't really achievable in 5 years or 10 years, or maybe not even 100 years. We don't really know. But we could perhaps at least turn away from what people are now calling extreme energy, kind of like extreme sports. It's the ones where it requires so much energy to accomplish gaining the energy source. So that's like the mountaintop removal. If you have to blow a whole mountaintop off to get the coal, that's pretty extreme. Hydrofracking, drilling in impossible places like the Arctic Sea. So there's a little category of these new energy technologies that are now sort of their own taxonomy of extreme energies. And maybe those are the two ends of the spectrums, the extreme and the freely, and how do you kind of swing the ship. So there's a lot of work there to do, to really head towards a more ethically manageable and sustainable relationship around energy. Because we use a lot of it. We can't have a society without it. So big koans, really big, impossible Zen koans, energy. Yeah. Well, maybe we should stop and go. If you want books, I can go out there and sign books, and I'm happy to talk with people. And really thank you, everybody, for.
Some refreshments at the hall, books for sale. Kaza will be out to sign some books.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.